Okay, well, first of all, to begin with, I want to welcome everybody. And one of the participants had sent me a question, which actually was apparently there earlier, but I had not seen it. And later on, Jim Bosco brought my attention to it. So I responded to the person. And here is the question. I invite everybody to look at it and I will read it aloud. The question was, if I see that I am unkind, does that change me to not be unkind? Is it weakened, or does the awareness diminish the unkindness? This was part of the background of that was, as I mentioned last time, that awareness is the mechanism of transformation. And so this question is naturally arising from that, and a very practical question. And so the answer that I did send to her, but I will be happy to read it here, and you can all probably see it on the screen. A short answer to your question is yes. My awareness of my own unkindness will affect my attachment to my unkindness and will gradually diminish it. What a searcher gradually realizes is that the fact that I see is much more important than what I see. What I see is potentially the whole realm of nature or prakriti and is endless. But the seeing, and sometimes one refers to this as the seer, is in our own domain. What is important is for us to realize that the seeing has many levels, and I need to practice enhancing the quality of my perceptions to make my seeing more steady, deeper, and impartial. As I honestly and directly see myself, I don't make excuses for myself or blame someone else for my attitude. If I see my unkindness, I suffer the fact that that is what I am, unkind. At the same time, I also don't need to shortchange myself. That is not all that I am. If I can remember that even in me there is a particle of divinity, and that part wishes me to be free of my unkindness. A very helpful comment of St. Augustine: our soul cannot be at rest until it is stayed in God. It is always helpful to think of an iconic figure. We can be sure that if the Buddha or the Christ were seen, the quality of their perception is going to be subtler than the quality of my perception. That immediately indicates to us that there are levels and qualities in every activity and in every trait. In principle, as the quality of my perception is enhanced, the effect it has on what is being perceived is enlarged. So I had written this in an email to her, but Jim Bosco felt it'd be good for everybody to both hear the question and the response. So it was really his suggestion to put it on the web here right now. So, but it is a very serious matter. I know we always have the impression that somehow some other mechanism will transform us. And it is worth repeating it again and again. Awareness, of course, deeper and deeper awareness, more and more impartial awareness, is what will actually transform me. Whatever I see in myself will find its right place. Okay, but I should also say I'm delighted whenever people have questions. I'm sorry I didn't actually notice this question last time. For example, right now also I see this question and answer part is blank on my screen at least. But maybe there's no hurry about writing questions. You can write to me later on. But question is really, if I'm searching for something, in a way, any serious question, as I mentioned even last time, can't really be answered by anybody except yourself. And the wish is that your serious questions will become a quest for you. It will take a long time, become the life's journey. So don't be hesitant about asking questions or raising questions. And my wish is to assist you to deepen your question rather than to provide you an answer. So we continue with what is yoga. And as I had mentioned last time also, that I'll focus mainly really on the second chapter. We did the very first sutra in the second chapter last time, which was to do with that the activities of yoga consist of three things: tapas, effort, and swadhyaya, self-study. There is no serious teaching which can possibly be against this idea. This is almost central to any kind of a spiritual development, a impartial self-knowledge, if you like, or self. The translation of Swadhyaya can be self-knowledge, self-study, self-inquiry, self-observation. All of these are possibilities. So we don't need to get stuck on the word. And then that is clearly central to any practice, also of yoga. Then the third one was Ishwar Pranidhan, and I especially went out of my way, particularly for people who have been brought up in the biblical tradition. It's somewhat inevitable. We are always conditioned by our culture. It is somewhat inevitable for them to think of submission to God as if God is somewhere else, something else. In the whole of the Indian tradition, including the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually more of a classic of yoga than the Yoga Sutras, I will speak about it next time a little bit. Then very strong emphasis that we have a particle of divinity in us, is a way of saying it, or that our deepest self is exactly identical with the very highest reality. The label used in the Indian tradition is Brahman. Or, of course, Krishna, for example, identifies himself in the Bhagavad Gita with the very highest being, Brahman. So, strong call in the whole of the tradition to try to find that level within oneself which is one with Brahman. And there is no need to forget this. One needs to come back to this again and again. So we will now proceed with the next sutra in the second chapter. And let me just bring this up here. This is the place where, in a way, Patanjali describes yoga slightly more positively. If you recall, the second sutra in the first chapter basically said yoga, chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is stopping the movements of the mind. Here it is expressed slightly more, if you like, more positively. What is the purpose of yoga? And you see here, there are two words which I will spend a fair amount of time on. But let me read this quickly here. Yoga is for cultivating samadhi and for weakening the kleshas, which are, I've given the translation here as hindrances. But it can also mean blemish, it can mean impediment, it can mean resistance, it can mean many of these things. And all this is a possible translation of the word klesha. But essentially, whatever stands in our way. So the purpose here, strictly speaking, is, as defined by Patanjali, that yoga is for cultivating samadhi. And we will come back to this, what is samadhi? And then what stands in the way? That needs to be diminished. I should make a general remark here, which is true really in a way about all traditions. Every serious spiritual teaching sooner or later becomes a religion, and therefore it begins to interfere with spiritual search. This has happened in India as well, which could hardly be surprising. So words like samadhi sometimes get translated almost like a trance, as if you forget what is all around you and you become totally unaware of this. This will completely shock somebody like Raman Maharishi or Aurobindo or Krishnamurti. These are among three of the more, if you like, wisest Indians in the 20th century, or the more, one would really say, more enlightened Indian. So for them, this will be a complete surprise that Samadhi means you're completely out of it, you are in a trance. But that is a fairly common attitude in it. So we will definitely come back to this. Let me already mention this. This is the third sutra in the third chapter of Patanjali, where Samadhi is defined. I'll come back to this in due course here. Let me now proceed here to see what are the various kleshas or the hindrances. I will stay with the word klesha simply because any translation is always a bit of a transcreation. A little bit depends on what part one wants to emphasize. So these are the two key words, samadhi and klesha. Now, these are the kleshas. Avidya, which is quite rightly translated as ignorance. Asmita, which is the sense of a separate self. Raga, attraction. Vesh is aversion. And abhinivesh, which is clinging to the status quo. These are the strong tendencies in every human being. So we don't need to take this personally. This is a remark I tried to make last time as well. Swadhyaya or self-study naturally begins from where I am and something particular to me, my difficulties, my problems. But very soon, as I go a little deeper within myself, self-study essentially becomes a study of the human condition. For example, if I actually discover that so much of my activity in my whole life is being driven by either some kind of anxiety or fear or some kind of an ambition, or one can express this in different ways. For example, a wish for approval and a fear of disapproval. As I begin to actually see this in myself, then one is actually beginning to see the whole human condition. Deeper I go within myself, closer I come to the depth of the other people as well. And certainly, from particularly in the perspective of the Indian teaching, if I can go to the very deepest part of myself, this is where I am now at the center not only of myself, but of the center of the whole universe, center of everybody, which is called labeled Brahma. So, therefore, one begins with self-study as if I was a separate self, separate from the others. But gradually one begins to see more and more relationship. Ultimately, a whole sense of oneness. This is absolutely central to the whole of the Indian tradition, from the Rig Veda right up to the Yoga Sutras. So here, let us come back to these kleshas. Ignorance is the first one. Let me actually even proceed further, because Patanjali then goes on to say that avidya is the cause of all the others. So that is the central difficulty. There is, as far as I am aware, there is no exception to this with any of the sages in India, from the most ancient to the most contemporary. They would all say that the main source of all our predicaments, all our difficulties, is ignorance, avidya. Just a little bit to remind you, because it's sometimes, especially I'm assuming that the majority of the people participating in this webinar have more or less a Judeo-Christian background. Even if you may not be practicing anything, just like people in India may not be practicing anything, but they are still influenced by their culture. That in the biblical tradition, the root cause of all our problems is not ignorance. It is the disobedience of the will of God. And it began with Adam in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, he was expelled. And therefore, consequently, precisely because we are all children of Adam, this becomes the doctrine of original sin in Christianity. Therefore, we inherit a sin by the mere fact of being born. This will completely surprise anybody in India. I will come back to this again, this idea. So this is a very important, already a great difference between the general Indian perspective and the general biblical perspective. And so in the Indian tradition, in any case, avidya, which is quite rightly translated as ignorance, is the cause of all the other kleshas, all the hindrances. So naturally, therefore, the solution to all our problems is vidya, which is the opposite of avidya. Vidya means knowledge. Now, this is where we have to be very clear what kind of knowledge one is speaking about. Let me say a little bit more about this. First of all, just to something that I just finished saying, that every sage in India emphasized that this is the problem, avidya. In Pali, which is the language in which the Buddha is said to have spoken, the word avidya becomes avijja, which is written here as avidya paramam malam, ignorance is the great blemish. This is from the Dhammapada. And then what is avidya? This is Patanjali's own description. This is the 5th sutra in the 2nd chapter. Avidya is seeing the transient as eternal, the impure as pure, dissatisfaction as pleasure, the non-self as self. In fact, in a fair amount of the Indian tradition, the very last part is more emphasized than anything else. That our main difficulty is that we don't know who we really are, and that we regard ourselves to be something which is transient. For example, if I think I am primarily my body, which by the way, we should not so easily dismiss this idea, this is the standard contemporary scientific point of view, that when the body dies, that's the end. Whereas all religious traditions, in fact, this is one of the very few things common to all religious traditions, they would all say that the death of the body is not the death of the person. That there is some other element, which one would generally call spiritual element, soul, which does not die when the body dies. And that furthermore, that continues, then exactly what happens to this soul in the post-mortem state, that varies from tradition to tradition. But they all agree that the death of the body is not the death of the person. And therefore, what is my real self is almost by definition, according to these traditions, is not the body, which is transient. Whereas something that is spirit is eternal, everlasting. And so that becomes really the main emphasis, as a matter of fact, in most of the tradition, in fact, in Patanjali as well, that to not be aware of one's real self, that is the real avidya, that's the real ignorance. But the other things are also there, it's good to keep in mind. Now, the kind of knowledge that is being spoken about is clearly not what we ordinarily would call knowledge. For us modern people, quite rightly, that's my own background in physics, science has become the paradigm example of knowledge. It is silly to be, in any sense, to be against that. But that is not the kind of knowledge that Patanjali is speaking about, or any of the sages who are speaking about Vidya that will liberate one, that will bring one to real understanding of who I really am. That's not the kind of knowledge they're speaking about. So I've gone back to the first chapter here to quote to you. This is the 49th sutra in the first chapter. The knowledge obtained in this state of consciousness, which is the state of right order, Ritambhara, if you are interested, The previous sutra to this says Tatra Prajya Ritambara. There the mind is full of order. So in that knowledge obtained in that state of consciousness is different from the knowledge obtained by testimony, which is what scriptural knowledge is. Somebody says, this is what the Buddha said, or this is what Christ said. It's by testimony. Or by inference, because that's what we largely do in the sciences. We observe certain things, then we generalize it. So by deduction or by induction. So scientific or philosophic or scriptural knowledge is not what is being spoken about here. This is the important thing to emphasize here. Nobody is against any of that. Certainly nobody in India, in any of the sages, were against scientific knowledge. There never was a trial of some scientists just because they produced some knowledge which disagreed with the scriptures. So it is important to keep this in mind, that the kind of knowledge Patanjali is speaking about, the word knowledge, we end up using it just because we don't have any other. But here are 4 words in Sanskrit. Almost always they get translated as knowledge. And I will take a minute to speak about each one of them, just to give you some notion. For example, the word Vidya gets translated as knowledge, but just as it will be helpful for you to realize, you can go to a big dictionary, English dictionary, that the English word video as well as vision is etymologically derived from this Sanskrit word Vidya, which already indicates to us what kind of knowledge we are speaking about. It's a knowledge which has to do with direct perception. Not, as I think it's almost useful to remember that this is practically the definition of a sage. A sage says what he or she sees, not what he thinks, not what he reads, not what he is deducing from something or the other, which is why we have this very classical remark about Christ, actually, in one of the Gospels. He spoke as one with authority, not as the scribes do. See, that authority comes from the direct perception. So that's the real meaning of Vidya. Gyan, which by the way in North India is generally pronounced as Gyan, is cognate with the Greek word gnosis, from which we get the word like Gnostic Gospels, which are again speaking about a subtler kind of knowledge, which of course, as you know, were declared non-canonical precisely because that subtler kind of knowledge required a lot of practice, or as Patanjali would say, lots of abhyas, a lot of vairagya, and a lot of swadhyaya, tapas, etc. All the things that we have been speaking about earlier. Bodhi is also often translated as knowledge, but it has the same root as the word Buddha, which is to say somebody who is awake. By inference, naturally, it means that in general most of us are asleep. And so Bodhi is much more to do with awakening, with discernment. So it's not just ordinary kind of knowledge. Prajya or Pragya, some of you may know a very classical text in the Buddhist tradition is called Pragya Parmita, often translated as wisdom of the other shore. Wisdom may be a little closer to it, but quite often it also gets translated as knowledge. So I'm just alerting you, particularly because in the Bhagavad Gita, this word gets much more used rather than Vidya. He speaks about, for Avidya, the word in the Bhagavad Gita is Ajnan, just the opposite of Jnan, putting an A in front. This is done in many Indo-European languages. Okay, so what we are speaking about, therefore, is a very different kind of knowledge. That is important to keep in mind. And again, let me keep emphasizing this. Every sage in India, as far as I am aware, and every, whatever we might call scripture, whether it's the Upanishads, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita, whether it's, well, the Yoga Sutra doesn't usually get called as a scripture, but a classical text in any case, all of them will emphasize this, that the root cause of all our problems is avidya. Okay. Therefore, a call towards a subtle or subtler knowing. I myself got stuck. I keep using the word knowledge just because we don't know what else to do here. The other klesha is asmita. This is almost as if this is the first product of ignorance. Literally, the word asmita means I am this or I am that, which is a way of, from the whole reservoir or the whole ocean of being, I take a fraction of it and I say, this is what I am. For example, supposing I say, I'm a professor. I'm also a father. I'm also a son. I'm also a lover. I'm also a consumer. All those are still something defined. But maybe I also have a particular divinity in me. Krishna repeatedly says in the Bhagavad Gita that he's seated in the heart of everyone, in the mind of everyone, and in the body of everyone. So why not? He's also in my body. So am I just a professor? So one needs to come back to this again and again, that to say I am this, whatever that this may be, is separating myself from the whole ocean of being, and therefore moves me away from the relationship with the whole, with the oneness of all there is. That is so central to the whole of the Indian tradition. Oneness, ekatvam in Sanskrit. That asmita is the cause of that sense of a separate self. Now, completely technically, this is how Patanjali describes it. Asmita is the misidentification of the power of seeing with what is seen. Just to remind you all, I don't know whether I got a chance to speak about it very much. Purusha, or the whole dimension of consciousness, that is the power of seeing. Sometimes it gets translated as a seer, but Patanjali explicitly says seer is essentially the power of seeing. So if I identify that with something that I can see, for example, I can see my body, I can see something else, I can see something, let us say I wrote a book, I can look at it. So now if I identify myself with that, Patanjali calls it the misidentification to begin with, because that is what gives this notion that I am separate from the whole. So that's a very more technical way of describing what asmita is. But the whole notion of a separate self, that is essentially what we are talking about when we speak about asmita. Then the next one is, here maybe before I even proceed to the next one, let me remind here, the separate self is sometimes referred to as the ego. The ego says, I am this, or I am that. The self, this is a nice way of doing this. In the Latin script, it is possible to put a capital S. As I mentioned last time also, in Sanskrit, we don't have small letters and capital letters. So everything has to be understood by the context, which requires a little bit more serious study rather than somebody puts a capital S, so we think that is clear. It's not very clear what capital S self is. Can you, for example, identify the capital S self in yourself? That would be very helpful. In any case, I'm here. We have to move on with what the sages say. So the ego says I am this, the self says I am. I will give two specific examples of this from the great texts. One is from the Gospel of John. Christ remarked, I am is the way and the truth and the life. I know it's a very Christian evangelical notion to remove this is. This is gets removed and simply say, I am the way and the truth and the life, as if this particular person. He so completely emptied himself so he could be filled with God. And let me just remind you, the word I am, or the phrase I am, is the actual translation of the word Jehovah, which is in a way also the meaning of the word Jesus. Jesus comes from the word Joshua, which is Yehoshua, which literally means Yahweh saves. And Yahweh is the meaning of the word I am. Any serious scholar of John's Gospel can tell you this. If you like, I'll happily give you references. But it should really be translated, I am is the way and the truth and the life. In any case, in the Upanishadic literature, Soham is the Sanskrit word, which literally means I am. And this is said to be the response of the great sages to the question, who am I? To mention this in Sanskrit will be helpful because there is a rhyming to it. In Sanskrit, the expression who am I is koham, who am I? And the response from any great sage is soham, I am. Not that I am this or I am that, but I am, which is participating in the wholeness of being. And that is really essentially the distinction between the ego and the self. Of course, we could put ego with a small s, self, if you like. One doesn't need to be against the ego either. Ego also has its function, but that will take me far away now, so I need to move on. Now, we move on to the next klesha, which is actually the next two are usually coupled together, partly because they are somewhat symmetrical. So here we look at it. Raga arises from dwelling on pleasant experiences, and dvesha arises from clinging to unpleasant experiences. And Patanjali is saying that these are great blemishes or great hindrances. Quite often, raga and dvesh are translated as like and dislike. And I like something, I don't like something. Any serious searcher very soon realizes that what I need to do is what I need to do, whether I like it or I don't like it. That liking, disliking is totally irrelevant. In fact, it is said, some of these things are in the tradition, whether it was actually said by the Buddha, we don't know. But it is said that the Buddha never did anything that he liked. I don't believe this means that he disliked everything he did. Essentially, it means that he was free of any like and dislike. This is also very much emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita or in any other serious teaching. One doesn't have to go to the Indian teachings for this. Every serious teaching, sooner or later, has to first of all advise or instruct the student to be free of like or dislike. If I'm learning mathematics or physics and a professor gives me a problem to solve, I say, well, I don't like that. Okay, so I don't need to study. It has nothing to do with whether I like it or I don't like it. That's the usual translation of raga and dvesha, and that is not altogether wrong. But there is something more here, more serious, which is, read it again. Raga arises from dwelling on pleasant experiences, and dvesha arises from clinging to unpleasant experiences. Now, that is really very perverse human situation, that we are actually clinging to unpleasant experiences. In fact, I invite you, this is actually going to be one of the exercises. If somebody admires you, or I can speak in the first person singular, occasionally somebody admires me. I feel about it for a little while. But 10 minutes later, I have no idea who this person is, what their name is. But if somebody humiliates me, calls me a son of a bitch or whatever else, that will stay with me much longer. We are more attached to our suffering than to our happiness. This may seem very bizarre, but I invite you to look at it yourself seriously. When I say attached to our suffering, doesn't mean we want to repeat the suffering. By attached, I mean we are stuck more with it. We are hammered more by it. It stays more strongly in our psyche than the happiness does. That's what I mean by being attached. In fact, among the contemporary sages, Gurdjieff was very strongly emphasizing this point, that a human being will give up anything, but will not give up his suffering. And I think there is much to be said for this. In fact, the whole profession of psychiatry and psychotherapy exists because we are attached to our suffering. Even if something happened to us at the age of 6 or 7 or 8, it can stay in our psyche for 30 years, 40 years. We are unable, therefore, to do certain things, maybe unable to have any decent relationship with the opposite gender, or to have a good job or whatever. Something interferes. What is it then a psychiatrist can do? If they are good at it, which is already a good if in my experience, but if they are good at it, at best, by various methods, by relaxing you, even by allowing you to more or less think about something in the past, etc., you can become aware of what caused the whole problem. And that awareness is what is able to transform something. As I said, even in the very first beginning today, in the response to the person who had asked that question, awareness is the mechanism of transformation. So, that we are attached to our suffering more than to our happiness may seem bizarre. But let me here also remind you that Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita has many different ways of more or less saying what is yoga. Here is one definition of yoga according to Krishna. And I have given a precise reference here. Chapter 6, Shloka 23rd. Dukkha Sanyoga Vyogam Yoga Sanyitam. Yoga is breaking the bond with suffering. That becomes practically the whole aim of yoga, because the reason for that is a very strong one. In order for us to be free of all our conditioning, etc., so that one can act freshly, freely, not just react. As I mentioned last time when I spoke about the law of karma, the first part of it is really basically as one is, so one reacts. But if I become aware of my conditioning, then I can, and that's the magic of that semicolon in that law of karma that I mentioned last time, then I can act otherwise. I can respond. Then that will transform. So that the second part of the law of karma then becomes, as one responds, so one becomes. So come back here. Yoga is breaking the bond with suffering simply because suffering more ties us to our past than happiness does. You don't need to take my word for it. You need to think about this yourself. This is actually one of the little exercises I have at the end today. Whole nations can get attached to suffering if they lost in some battle or the other. We have particular examples of this in Canada especially. And so Krishna actually gives one of the definitions of yoga. He has many different ways of defining yoga. As I just finished saying even earlier, Bhagavad Gita is actually more of a classical text of yoga because it has a whole varieties of yogas, whereas Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is really meant more or less for people who have nothing else to do. except sit in meditation. He's not in the battle of life. Patanjali doesn't speak about love, for example, or even one word. No, but I know in almost yoga teaching, training people, they ask you to memorize something from Patanjali Yoga Sutra because it's a much smaller text. It's probably easier. But the Bhagavad Gita is actually a much more serious yoga text. Maybe I'll give more webinars about this. But come back to this definition of yoga given by Krishna. Yoga is breaking the bond with suffering. Then we come to the next klesha, which is abhinivesh. Abhinivesh, now again, this is very peculiar. You probably have several translations of the Yoga Sutras, or some of you may have several, and please look up. Often it is translated as that abhinivesh is the wish to continue living, as if there is something wrong with this idea of continuing living. This again comes from a very ascetic streak in the Indian tradition, which very much exists. There is no question of denying this, which just finds the whole world is Maya and that no action needs to be done here. Somehow one needs to get away from it, etc. And therefore, the wish to continue living is not a good idea. Abhinivesh simply means, as I have translated here, is the automatic tendency for continuity. It overwhelms even the wise. This is what Patanjali says. But we stay with the first part of it. Some of you may know the first law of motion of Newton, which actually says if a body is at rest or it is in linear motion, it continues to be at rest or in linear motion, unless there is an external force implied. That is the law of inertia. That's exactly what abhinivesha is. Of course, Newton is speaking about external world, material movement, etc., or movement of material particles. Patanjali is much more psychologically speaking here. So we have a very deep tendency for the status quo. And it's somewhat understandable because any major change creates what we usually call fear of the unknown. I remember a conversation with Krishnamurti, was very strongly. He said, "Sir, if it is unknown, it is unknown. How can it create fear or anything else?" He was very strong about it, that it is not the fear of the unknown, it is the attachment to the known that is causing the problem. Which is why a title of one of his books is Freedom from the Known. And this is important to keep in mind. We are very much attached to what we know, and what we don't know, we therefore think it will cause fear. Maybe in this context, I should also remind you of, this is the last dialogue of Plato, Phaedo, in which Socrates has been condemned to drink hemlock. He is going to die. So quite understandably, many of his disciples are very sad about it. They gather. Some of them are crying. So this is what Socrates says to them. You all seem to be behaving as if you know what happens after death. And furthermore, as if you know what happens after death is worse than what happens before death. As for myself, since I do not know, therefore I am free. In my personal judgment, this is absolutely one of the most classical sentences in the whole of philosophy in the world, especially in the Western world, Western philosophy. Since I do not know, therefore I am free. Not knowing is not a matter of ignorance. Nobody is recommending ignorance. Not knowing is a state of unknowing in which I am open to whatever comes. I don't need to be pigeonholing it in the categories that I know. I'm willing to be surprised. So abhinivesh is the automatic tendency for continuing the state I am in. Some of you may have read much of the existentialist literature by, say, for example, Sartre or Camus. Somebody may have a completely miserable dog or miserable life, but they somehow are so attached to it, it continues. So attachment to continuation is very strong. So personally, I tend to think of abhinivesha is almost the addiction to the status quo. And which is why every serious spiritual teaching recommends, almost as if a spiritual practice is a practice of dying daily to whatever I know, whatever I have accumulated. It's almost a matter of recovering my innocence. Here, let me draw your attention to 2 or 3 quotes. This is St. Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians. I die daily. Clearly, one would be quite silly to take anything literally here. Unfortunately, it's very much done by all kinds of evangelists. The whole Gospels get taken literally, which means spiritual realities are materialized, materialistic. So, here let me show you another one. This is a Sufi saying. If you die before you die, you do not die when you die. Here is the remark of Krishnamurti. The real question is, this was actually a conversation I had with him in 1985 from the recording. Can I die while I'm living? Can I die to all my collections, material, psychological, religious? If you can die to all that, then you'll find out what is there after death. Either there is nothing, absolutely nothing, or there is something. But you cannot find out until you actually die. So you see the kind of dying that is being suggested is really a recovery of an innocence. Can I be free of all the reactions I had yesterday, all the problems, all the suffering? And this is where freedom from suffering is very crucial, because that is what more connects me with the past than anything else in my life. And therefore, actually, in fact, a practice of daily meditation is, strictly speaking, a practice of dying to the world for an hour. That you, at that time, do not wish to engage with what ordinarily one is obliged to engage. The whole world is engaged. So, this is it. This question of abhinivesha is a very serious matter, and it really does require a freedom from the known. So, since our time is going to be running short, as always, that's why in India they always say time is the great enemy. Here is a remark of Michelangelo, which I'd like you to consider. I saw an angel in the stone. I just chiseled and chiseled till I set him free. All our kleshas need to be chiseled away so that your real self can actually be set free. And that real self is not my usual ego. I am this, I am that. Now we can come to the definition of Samadhi by Patanjali. You don't need to take my word for it. You can look at the sutras yourself. Samadhi is the state when the self is not. He could have happily used the word ego here, but ego means many things. So I was intentionally, this is my own translation, and I intentionally try to avoid that word as much as I can. But in common parlance, one ends up using it. So, small s self, if you like. Samadhi is the state when the self is not, when there is awareness only of the object of meditation. Patanjali's own description of this is so that the mind can be so clear, like a clear diamond. Wherever it's put on any object, it will reveal the object without introducing any colors of its own. That's the whole. So therefore, it's nothing against the mind. But as I said in the very first webinar we had, mind is not the knower. Mind is an instrument of knowledge. Just as microscope is not the knower, but it's an instrument. It can be a good instrument or a bad instrument. So very important to have a good mind, clear mind. So we see that is the definition of samadhi, in which self is not. And I have already been saying this several times, the aim of any spiritual practice is not freedom for myself, but freedom from myself. And here we just saw this example from Patanjali's definition of samadhi. Samadhi is not some kind of a trance state in which you're totally unaware of what's going on. It will completely surprise many of the sages in India. Okay, so then I would propose these two exercises if you wish to try them. I have, as you know, each time I propose an exercise, if you find it helpful, we don't have enough time to be sharing all this, but yourself, or you can share it with a friend. First exercise here, are you more attached to suffering or to happiness? You don't need to take anybody's word for it. Any serious searcher can be assisted by others, can be assisted by scriptures or by anything else, even by the enemies. But the project remains truly individual. The other exercise which I am suggesting here, what is the angel you occasionally see in the depth of your own psyche? What hindrances need to be chiseled away? Is it addiction to the status quo? It's not easy to change things. Major changes, people get into all kinds of stress about even moving from one house to another. Imagine moving from one body to another, which is what Krishna says happens. We die. So that will be a whole different big house being shifted. So those two exercises I am suggesting to you. Now, I should also say, I see that anybody can go to my website, which is simply ravindra.ca, not .com, .ca for Canada, good country. And there you will find many articles which you can read if you wish on different topics, and even lots of audio-visual items are listed there. You can easily either have the link to them or actually right there. So, and there is this other quotation here that you can, I don't know whether you see this here. Spiritual progress is when one becomes free not only of the knowledge which is inevitably from the past, but also from the need to know, which is inevitably entangled with a desire to predict and control. Just as there is a state of non-action, which is not a state of inaction, similarly, there is a state of unknowing, which is not a state of ignorance. This is very important. These are the great, there are corresponding Sanskrit words which are difficult to translate all this, but nevertheless, it is very important to come back to this. I know something, but even if I had the combined brain of the best scientist, best philosopher in the history of the world, I cannot know all there is to know. Therefore, one needs to remain, keep coming back to a state of unknowing, open to anything that might happen. Okay, I think we would basically stop here unless somebody specifically now wishes to raise a question. I don't see any question written here. My friend Jim Bosco had pointed out to me last time that I missed one here last time. But otherwise, think of these two exercises for your own sake and speak to a friend. It can help clarify more and more. Now, next time, I will still largely stay with the second chapter because there are many other things there to be spoken about. Shouldn't we keep chiseling till there is nothing but dust on the ground? Yes, yes, keep chiseling until I am not. I am not in the sense of ego is not. It's there, but it is not the important thing. And so that is what one means by saying freedom from the self. Freedom from the self does not mean to be against the self. In fact, if I could say this as a general remark, don't be against anything, absolutely anything. Because whatever you are against, you can't be free of it. You basically come down to the same level as the thing you are against. Particularly if you think, especially in the Bible, if you become against the devil, then you've really had it. Because the devil is the great examiner. Nobody can come to God until they have been certified by the devil. So devil is the most faithful servant of God. So in your own case, if you actually see something that you need to be, you feel that you want to get rid of it, no, watch it, see it, don't be against it. Study it almost with affection. Even the devil. This was the great enlightenment of the Buddha. The very last thing it is said in the Buddhist tradition that he was being bothered by Mara, which is the equivalent of the devil in the Buddhist tradition, and that he saw that Mara was a part and parcel of himself. These also are. Okay, thank you very much.